Hello, I'm Kads and welcome to today's video. So today we're going to be talking about shard pulling, the ultimate shard pulling guide. We're going to break down each of the different types of shard events, pros and cons, as well as which one's best for your unique situation. Now I've already done a video somewhat like this on my channel, but I wanted to revisit it given some of the more recent shard analyses that I've seen popping up around on YouTube. So let's start with the most popular of them all, the standard 2x event. Coincidentally, we do have one going on right now for ancient shards. Some of the pros for 2x events are that you get the best rates for epics. As you can see here, it is doubled. The void can be an example of the base rates of 8%. And for the 2x here, for ancient shards, it's doubled. Obviously, the best epics logic doesn't apply to sacreds because you can't get anything lower than an epic. And this, it would be effectively worse for epics, but it's better for legendaries. Similarly, you do get a good legendary rate. I'm not going to call it the best. It is not the best overall, depending on the situation, but you do get a good legendary rate of 1% of 1 in 100. And even if you are unlucky, you will be building up mercy, which could help you in some of the other types of events. Of course, we cannot talk about the good without the bad, so some of the cons are that pulling during a 2x is not guaranteed. Unless you go all the way out to mercy, 220 shards for ancients, and all the way out to 60, believe it or not, for sacred shards, you will not be guaranteed a legendary at all, so it is a gamble. In addition to that, you do not know what you're going to get, so you're getting a legendary, which could be anything good or bad from any of the ones in the shard pool. 2x events are best designed for people with lower shard counts. So obviously, I do not fall into that category given the amount of shards that I have, but if you have 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 or less ancient shards, then you probably don't have enough to save up for any of the other types of events, and you're better off trying your luck during the 2x just in case you might get lucky. But also, you could be still working on developing your account, and getting a lot of epics along the way isn't the worst thing in the world. Particularly for those in the early and the mid game, the backbone of your account is going to be some really key epics, but eventually you might outgrow them. Some of them, not all of them. Some epics are still very, very good into the end game, but a lot of them you might outgrow as you replace them with legendaries as your account develops. Now, some of you may have heard within the raid community that a 2x is not actually a 2x. While there is some truth to that statement, it is not entirely correct, and there's one primary premise that is wrong about it. Now, the most recent example of this analysis was conducted by the Aftershock Media Group and is summarized here in this spreadsheet. And the logic for saying that a 2x is not a 2x comes from these two values here, where you can see they're roughly around 1.5 instead of 2, and thus they are asserting that 2x's are more like 1.5x's. Unfortunately, these values make the cardinal sin of assuming that one's results have to equal the rates. That's not how probability works. And what I mean by that is if you have a 1 in 100 chance of something happening and you do the action 100 times, it is not guaranteed that you will get the desired result one time. That's not how probability works. You could do it 300 times and it could still not happen, or you could do it 300 times and it could happen 5 times. There's a give and take, and that is how probability works. So now I'm going to break down this sheet so you guys understand exactly what these numbers mean, and thus we can have a better understanding of what they're trying to say. So for starters, let's begin with the odds that you hit mercy. Now, for a non-2x, you can see that this value is around 36%. This is a pretty standard statistical value for the chance of you hitting or not hitting the drop rate. It's about 64-36, or you can call it 2/3, 1/3 if you want to round. And what this number means is that in the case of an ancient or a void shard for a non-2x, if you pulled 200 shards an infinite number of times, 64% of the time you will have gotten one legendary, and 36% of the time you will have gotten 0 legendaries. This is a pretty common statistical number as far as 64% chance of hitting the drop rate by the drop rate. As you'd expect, considering that if you apply the 2x factor to it, then your odds of hitting mercy go down and your odds of a legendary by 200 go up. If we jump over to the sacreds, you can see that these values aren't exactly the same, and the only reason for that is because the mercy for sacreds kicks in at 12, and the base rate for pulling a legendary from a sacred is about 1 in 16. In other words, because the mercy system kicks in before you hit the threshold of the drop rate, you're more likely then to hit mercy. And speaking of mercy, if we scroll all the way down here to the bottom section for ancient and void shards, you can see this is where the color changes and the mercy system starts to kick in. The important thing to note here is this column here where it is detailing the chance to not get a legendary. Now you can see here, generally speaking, that the trend is a little less than 1-ish% per shard that you pull. However, once the mercy system kicks in and it starts adding 5% per shard to get a legendary, you can see that it starts to drop off dramatically towards 0. And it is worth noting here that the mercy system is bad luck mitigation. And what that means is that the mercy system is actually cutting off all odds, and that's all odds, to not get a legendary past 221 shards, which normally, if you just look at raw odds, would be in the realm of possibility. And how that manifests, if we scroll back to the top here, that manifests in you having an effective drop rate that is below the raw chance from the shard of about 1 in 130 or 1 in 128 here, and for 2x is about 87 instead of 100. And again, that gap comes from the mercy system literally truncating all of your probabilities past 221 shards to not give you a legendary. So only once you account for that truncation of probability, then you can ratio these two values, and that is where you get this 1.47 for ancients and voids, and that's where you get the 1.55 for sacreds. However, this is why you cannot say that a 2x is not a 2x, because as we established in the beginning, the result here, which is 1.47, does not have to equal the rate, which would be 2. A 2x event is not guaranteeing that you will have 2 times the results if you pull compared to an off 2x. It's saying that while you're pulling during the 2x, your chances are doubled. That's it. You may or may not get anything from those doubled pulls, but the rate is nonetheless doubled. Your results may vary, and that's why it is somewhat misleading to say that a 2x is not a 2x. So hopefully that made sense to you guys, but if you do have any questions about what I explained there, then feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. But for now, let's continue on and talk about the corollary to 2x events, and that would be 10x events. Now, conveniently, once again, we do have a 10x going on right now from Ancient Shards to get Harima. And what a 10x means is that if you were to get a legendary, there will be 10 times as many Harimas in the legendary pool that you can get from. This does equate to the best chance to get that specific legendary, assuming you get a legendary at all. Unfortunately, that's just about the only pro for 10x events. For the cons, typically 10x events have the base summoning rates, so 8% for an epic or 1 in 200 or 0.5% for legendaries. Which means, of course, that you will get less epics overall, and you have a smaller chance to get a legendary at all. In this particular case, we do have the convenient overlap of a 2x with a 10x, so you do have a higher chance to get a legendary at all. And if you were to get that legendary, you also have the elevated chance for that legendary to be Harima specifically. However, as we can discuss in the spreadsheet here, that chance is still relatively low overall. So here we have the 10x rate calculator, if we have it for single, double, and triple 10x's, and in this case, we do have a single 10x. The entire champion pool from Ancient Shards is 148, that is 148 different legendaries unique that you could pull from an Ancient Shard when you get a legendary. When you have a single 10x going on, if you get a legendary, you only have a 6.4% chance of that legendary, in this specific case being Harima. And again, we must establish that the result does not necessarily equal the rate. So when I say 6.4% or about 1 in 20, 1 in 19, that does not mean that if you were to magically pull 19 to 20 legendaries, that one of them will be Harima. The odds suggest that that could be the result, but that's not a guarantee of the result. For Sacred Shards, there's not a big difference between those, but there are slightly less legendaries in the pool, but you get a similar value for single, double, and triple 10x's. Now for Voids, it does get a lot better. The pool is a lot smaller, so if there is a single 10x going on, then you have about a 19% chance of getting that specific legendary if you were to get a legendary at all. So 10x's, just considering the amount of legendaries in each of their respective pools, is the best time to try for a 10x if you have the shards and you know you're probably going to get a legendary, because you have closer to a 1 in 5 chance instead of a 1 in 20 chance of it being that specific champion. So overall, the best situations for 10x's are actually during fusions and fragment summons, because those always feature a practically mandatory summon rush that is always during a 10x, and thus you have to pull some amount of shards to get the fragments or the rares for that specific fusion or fragment summon. If you also want to target that specific champion and you know with some level of certainty, or you're gambling, that you're going to get a legendary, that is the best chance ever to get that specific legendary. Also, since 10x's typically occur during CVC or Clan v Clan tournaments, that could also be a good way to rack up some CVC points, but also try your luck at getting that specific champion featured during the CVC. Next, let's talk about guaranteed events, the most recent of which was 110 voids for Chogger. Now, the pros for guaranteed events are that you know what you're getting. It's guaranteed. So if I had pulled 110 void shards, I will have gotten Chogger guaranteed, no questions asked. In addition, since that guaranteed legendary does not reset your mercy, you could get lucky along the way and pick up a different legendary or multiple. As for the cons, of course, if you don't have the required number of shards, then you can't do it at all. No questions asked. You have to have enough to pull all of them to get the guaranteed champion, or else you will not make it and you will have wasted some shards. Since these typically do not coincide with 2x events, that means you also have the base summoning rates, so you will get less epics along the way if that is one of your concerns. And of course, the worst thing of them all, you might not even want the guaranteed champion. So for example, they had maybe a year ago or a couple years ago, they had a guaranteed event for Gamaran, who to me was a relatively useless legendary. And even though I had enough shards to do it, ancient shards, I didn't want him, so I didn't pull for him. In contrast, they also had a guaranteed event for Stultus Dragonbane, a defense-based nuker who I did want, and I did pull 150 ancients to get him because to me he was desirable. And as I mentioned before, I did get lucky along the way, and I also got another legendary, that one being Lady Kimmy. So guaranteed events are best for a couple of situations. One, having a high shard count. Now, this does not mean buying shards to ensure that you have a high shard count, but it could mean, like myself, free to play, just saving your shards up over time and waiting for the right time or the right champion and then pulling them. But the point is you have to have the required number of shards for the guarantee, or else you will not get the champion. Guaranteed events are also good if you like the champion, because then you feel like it's worth it to spend X amount of shards to get them. In worst case, if you don't get anything along the way, and let's take ancient shards for example here, if you pull 150, you don't get anything but the guaranteed champion, then now you're 150 shards deeper into Mercy, which can set you up nicely for different types of events and scenarios where you now know that you're guaranteed a legendary within the remaining shards until Mercy. And lastly, we have the POGO events, as I like to call them, or pull one, get one. Now, the pros for a POGO event are fairly obvious. That one, you're getting 2 legendaries for the cost of 1, because you just get a bonus when you get a legendary at all. And as you'd expect, this pairs really, really well with the Mercy system, meaning that if you know you're within X amount of shards from Mercy, you are guaranteed, once again guaranteed, to get a legendary, and thus you will get 2 from that same amount of shards. Now, similar to guaranteed events, this one can be somewhat tricky in the amount of shards you need because it is somewhat unknown because you're hoping that you get a legendary along the way, or if you're planning, then you know you're going to get a legendary from Mercy at a certain point. You're once again back to the base rates here unless this happens to coincide with a 2x, which typically is not the case. These are also typically during the week, meaning you cannot dip into the rewards from a champion chase or a summon rush. And just like 2x/10x events, now we're back to the unknown unknowns of you do not know who you're going to pull. Only a guaranteed event guarantees that you will get that specific legendary. So POGO events are best once again for a high shard count. And what that means in this context, which is slightly different than the guaranteed event, is that a POGO event is an all or nothing. Meaning if you do not get a legendary at all, then you're simply wasting your shards and it's not worth pursuing. So you could either blindly gamble and just hope that if you pull 60 Ancients, you'll hit the POGO and you're scot-free and you're far away from Mercy, or you know where you are relative to Mercy and you know that within said 60 shards, you will hit Mercy and thus you are guaranteed to get your double legendary. So when I say a high shard count, I just mean that you need to be prepared for the potential that you will go all the way out to Mercy without getting legendary because you are rolling on the base rates. And as we discussed in the spreadsheet, there is a 64% chance that you will go all the way out to Mercy for Ancient Shards, and about a 50-50 shot for Sacreds. So once again, POGO events are best for a relatively high shard count, meaning you have enough to go all in, but it's also good if you know where you are relative to Mercy and you know you can hit it, thus guaranteeing you will get to legendaries. So as you may have noticed, I do myself have a plethora of shards, and you might be wondering what my personal strategy is for pulling them. If you are a more frequent viewer on the channel, then you will know during my shard pull videos, I always feature my Mercy tracker here, the spreadsheet, and as you can see, I track where I'm at relative to Mercy for legendaries and epics. So overall, I would say that my strategy is to be fairly flexible. Some events I do and some of them I don't, depending on where I am relative to Mercy. I typically have an amount of shards that I will pull for every 2x, and that is primarily to get the legendary tome from the champion chase tournaments that are always at 3,000 points. So there is some minimum floor of shards I need to pull to get there, as well as I might offset it with some fragment summon champions or fusion champions. For 10x's, as I mentioned earlier, they're practically mandatory for the completion of fusions and or fragment events, so I pull the appropriate amount of sacreds and or mystery shards to get those fragments and or the rares. For guaranteed events, it has to be a champion that I want and an amount of shards that I either have or am willing to pull. So Stultus Dragonbane, I was willing to pull the 150 ancient shards, but Chogger, even though I did want him, I was not willing to pull 110. Had he been 80, I actually would have done it, and there would have been a video for it, but 110 was too steep for me, and so I refused to pull my shards, even though I did want the champion. For POGO events, my rule of thumb is that if I'm 100 shards out from Mercy, then I'll go for the POGO event. That means that within those 100 shards, I'm guaranteed to get 2 legendaries because I will hit Mercy. So once again, in summary, my strategy overall is there is a baseline of shards that I pull for every 2x because I'm trying to get the legendary tome from the champ chase. There is a certain amount that I pull for 10x's that coincide with a summon rush during fusions or fragment summons. For guaranteed, if I like the champion, I have enough shards, and I'm willing to pull the number of shards, then I will go for the guaranteed. And POGOs, if I'm close enough to Mercy, then I will pursue it. Alrighty, so that's going to do it for today's video. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have any comments or questions, then feel free to leave them down below in the comment section. If you are curious, I am planning to pull for this 2x Ancients, and I will be doing that tomorrow, but I'm waiting for the 10x on Harima to end, even though the chance of getting her, if I get a legendary at all, is relatively low, as I talked about in this video. I still don't want her in particular on my account, and so I would like to minimize the chance of getting her / maximize the chance of getting someone else. As always, if you found this video informative and or helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below, and if you enjoyed this video or others on the channel, then feel free to hit that subscribe button also down below for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.